If ever there was a classic case of an irresistible force pitted against an immovable object, the Palestine-Israel conflict is it. Two peoples both insist that the same piece of land is rightfully theirs, and have been fighting over it for more than 70 years. What are we as Christians to think of the claims of the Israeli and Palestinian peoples? How can faith inform our viewpoint? And how are we to respond? Today we'll look at those questions and more with Dr. Naim Ateek. Dr. Ateek is a Palestinian and Anglican priest and the co-founder of the Sabeel Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center. He's the former Canon of St. George's Cathedral in Jerusalem and the author of several books, including A Palestinian Theology of Liberation, The Bible, Justice, and the Palestine-Israel Conflict. I'm Allison Kenny, and this is Catholic Focus.
While the Israel-Palestine conflict is complex, most historians trace its origins to the period starting around the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. In the 1880s, a steady stream of Jewish colonists began to settle in Palestine, an area whose population had been predominantly Arabic since the 7th century AD. The migration of Jews to Palestine was fueled in part by the growing ideology of Jewish nationalism, the idea that after centuries of persecution and oppression, the only solution for Jews was a state of their own. This is also called Jewish Zionism. As Palestine roughly corresponded to the territory of the ancient kingdoms of David and Solomon, it was viewed as the ancestral homeland of the Jews, and so became the focus of the Zionists' cause. After World War I, the French and British carved up the territory of the collapsed Ottoman Empire, with the British coming to control an area called the British Mandate for Palestine. Tensions and sectarian violence continued to rise during this time between Arabs and Jews, and each of these groups with the British. During and after the Second World War, the Holocaust fueled increased support around the world for an independent Jewish state. And in 1947, the United Nations approved a plan to divide British Palestine into two distinct states, one for Jews, Israel, and one for Arabs, Palestine. Many neighboring Arab nations saw this plan as just another form of European colonialism, so in 1948 declared war on the newly independent state of Israel. Israel won the war, and in the process occupied territory past the borders of the UN plan. It is estimated that at that time, around 750,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes. And it's here that Dr. Naim Ateek's story begins.
Dr. Ateek, thank you for making time to talk to us. Welcome to Catholic Focus.
Thank you for inviting me.
In 1948, you were a young boy living about a 40-minute drive from Nazareth when the war started. Can you tell us a bit what that was like for you and your family?
Well, it turned our lives upside down, actually, because we were living in this small town south of the Sea of Galilee, Bisan. And our life in Bisan was very beautiful, in many ways. I'm one of 10 children. My father was able to buy a piece of land and build 3 houses on it. So we had a large house, and I have beautiful memories as a boy with the music that we used to have at home and the dancing and the singing all the time. And when the Zionist militias came to town and occupied it, our life totally changed. And we were evicted at gunpoint from our home. So we were supposed to meet at the center of town, and they divided us into 2 groups, the Muslims on one side, the Christians on the other. And then they took all the Muslims just down the River Jordan and let them go there. And then they took all of us Christians and dumped us on the outskirts of the town of Nazareth, and we were never allowed to go back to our homes or property or business. And And what happened to my family happened to thousands and thousands of Palestinian families who some people fled because they were afraid of what the Zionists will do. Other people stayed, but then they were forced to leave. So 750,000 Palestinians were dispossessed.
Wow.
It's a big number. And in order for the government of Israel to prevent the return of these refugees, Israel bulldozed almost 500 towns and villages throughout Palestine. In a few areas, it did not destroy those homes, like our family home was not destroyed, but they brought in Jewish families to replace us. And, we left our furniture, we left our everything. So they came and took over our homes. But in most of the cases, all the villages were destroyed.
So when that happened, you've now described that as a threefold Nakba, or a threefold catastrophe, and that is really a way of understanding the ways that being dispossessed has affected the Palestinian people as a whole.
Yes.
What are the elements that make up that threefold Nakba?
Yeah, Nakba, to begin with, means catastrophe. So we believe that it was not only the physical, the human catastrophe, Nakba, that they came and dispossessed us. That was there, and that was terrible. But also, in many ways, we had an identity Nakba. That our whole identity as Palestinians was erased. We could not refer to ourselves as Palestinians. Those of us who remained in that area of Palestine that became the State of Israel, you see. So our identity was totally erased. We were known as Arabs, Israeli Arabs. The word Palestinian was, again, totally rejected, and people could not use it. So we were known more generically as Arabs. So we lost our identity in that sense. It was tragic for many of us. Even beyond the identity Nakba, we had a faith Nakba, because what happened to us made many people, many Christians, ask questions about where is God? Why are we dispossessed? What happened? We did not have anything to do with the Holocaust, but we lost Palestine because of the Holocaust, because the Jewish people were encouraged to come to Palestine, those who survived the Holocaust. So our faith was shaken by the tragedy of Palestine, the Nakba, and so on. So these were things that affected us in a comprehensive way. So our life was shattered in many ways. And that's why Palestinian Liberation Theology many years later was trying really to address these different Nakbas.
And that was my next question, is where does Palestinian Liberation Theology come in to all of this, in amidst the Nakba?
For many years, we just were under the occupation of the government of Israel. And the discrimination, was great, because we refused to leave in that sense. And they had evicted so many, but those of us who stayed became second-class citizens in our own home, in our own country. So that was very difficult. So many years later, actually, we're talking about 1948, but Palestinian Liberation Theology emerged in 1987 with the first Intifada, when the Intifada started. And so the people of the land, the indigenous people, the Palestinian the Palestinians rose up in what we call intifada, which really means shaking off, the intifada. And that led to a new consciousness among the Palestinians that something is wrong. We need to resist non-violently. And some people resist violently also, which is under international law is permitted. When you are occupied by another country, you need to resist, including armed resistance. But we as Christians refuse to do this. And when Palestinian Liberation Theology emerged, we were very clear that we need to choose the way of Jesus. And the way of Jesus, we believe, was the way of nonviolence. And so we encourage people to resist the occupation, but through nonviolent methods.
So in a nutshell, how would you describe Palestinian liberation theology to someone who wasn't familiar with the concept?
Palestinian Liberation Theology is a way of resisting the occupation. It really begins with the context of occupation, the context of violence, the context of oppression of the people, and asking the question, what can we do, to work for liberation? And what does God expect of us to do? How God expects of us to be very contextually aware of the situation and using nonviolence in trying to resist the occupation and trying really to express it in a theological way, and also lifting up a vision for justice, for peace. That's why at the heart of this liberation theology is the work of justice. And we believe that it's not we who are defining justice. We accept the way international law defines justice. And United Nations resolutions reflect also a way of addressing the conflict and finding a resolution for the conflict. The problem is that the international community, especially the United States and in the beginning Britain also, were not open and were not ready and were not willing to enforce international law and ask the government of Israel to implement United Nations resolutions. That was the problem. And so Palestinian Liberation Theology emerged to really give a voice of the voiceless. It's a voice that lifts up the question of justice, peace, reconciliation. And that's, I think, the way it emerged.
It seems to me that with this conflict, religion has been in the background or has been influencing the conflict for quite some time. I've heard it said that it's not a conflict about religion, but since the beginning, people and groups have used religion to advance their political goals on both sides. What are the ways that, as you see it, that religion has been used to inform the Israeli understanding of the conflict?
It's the way it was used, continues to be used, is by using certain scriptures, certain biblical texts, in order to justify their oppression of the Palestinian people. The Bible is a big book, and some of these texts actually reflect a tribal understanding of God. When I say tribal, I'm talking about very exclusive understanding of God. So many of the religious Jewish exclusive and settler people who are living in the settlements, they're using some of these texts. For example, there are texts in which God tells Moses, when you go into the land, drive the people of the land out. There are texts that talks about utterly destroying the people of the land in the name of God. They say, oh, God said this, it's written in the Bible, and these Canaanites in the Bible are today the Palestinians.
And so you talk about in the book how Christ is the key to move away from that Old Testament tribal understanding of God, and that instead we should let Jesus inform our view of the conflict. How do you think Christ's example speaks to the conflict?
But before I answer this, I need to say that for many Jewish people and religious people, they don't accept the way some of these extremists are using the Bible. But the reason why I talk about them, because today they make up part of the government of Israel, these extremists.
So their voice is quite loud.
They're people of power now, because they're not only just living out their faith or religion, they are in positions of power, and they are using they're using these texts to justify their oppression of the Palestinian people. So within the Old Testament itself, you find an almost evolution, a development of a more inclusive understanding of God, and critiquing those exclusive texts that these settlers are using. But when we come to the New Testament, obviously, Jesus is being perceived as the liberator, the paradigm of faith. Jesus inspires us to work for justice, inspires us to work for in nonviolence against the occupation. So these things are there. And actually, when Palestinian Liberation Theology started, our people getting together and reflecting on the text and reflecting on the discrimination and the violence of the occupation, began to reflect on the importance of living under occupation as Christians, And then they also discovered the fact that Jesus himself lived under the Roman occupation.
It's true. He lived in an occupied territory,
exactly.
Right? At that
so
time.
All his life, Jesus Christ was living under occupation. And so our people started to see Jesus as a Palestinian like themselves, living under occupation. And when that happened, they began to look to Jesus Christ as the paradigm of their faith and asking, how did Jesus live under occupation? How can we learn from him? So it drove many of our people to begin to study the Gospels, because that's where we learn about Jesus and the way he lived his life under occupation. And finally, he was killed by the occupation forces in collusion with the religious leaders of the day. So it can be a very meaningful way of to reflect on the way Jesus lived his life and on the way we can learn from him in our work for justice, for peace, for reconciliation today.
What would you say to people who believe that Palestinian Liberation Theology is anti-Semitic or is anti-Jew? Do you have an answer to that?
It is not, but people use it, use anti-Semitism as a weapon to silence the discussion. So they come to me, but many people, especially in Canada and the United States, they don't want to be called anti-Semitic, so it silences them. And that's exactly the objective of being called anti-Semitic. But don't give them that privilege. You need to take a stand and tell them, you're not going to silence me. I know what's happening in Palestine-Israel. I know the oppression. I know the violence which is done and used by the Israeli army and the Israeli settlers. And I'm not going to stop talking about it because it is wrong and it's a violation of international law. So it is that kind of courage that we are asking people to show whenever somebody is trying to silence them.
Do you think it's important for Western Christians or Western people in general to develop an understanding of the conflict and to stand in solidarity with Palestinians?
Absolutely. And they need to know that there are many Jewish people standing with us also. So there are many, I was on a book tour in Canada these last 2 weeks. And almost everywhere I spoke, there were a few Jews who are for justice. And they are against the policies of the government of Israel. So you're not standing alone. You're also standing by Canadian citizens who are Jewish and who are speaking out against the injustice. But I think it's very important for Christians to get the facts. So when they're speaking out of knowledge. And if they don't know, I would encourage them to come and visit. And we can help them in organizing their time in Palestine-Israel so that they can see for themselves. So I encourage them to come. And it will change their life once they come and see.
All right, well, Dr. Ateek, thank you very much for joining us on Catholic Focus. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much for this time with you. Thank you. Jesus, from the very beginning, was no stranger to human suffering. Soon after his birth, he fled the massacre of the innocents and was forced to become a refugee in Egypt. He was harassed by the powerful of his day and was ultimately unjustly sentenced to death and crucified. Jesus had a special place in his heart for the marginalized. His ministry took him to the blind, the lepers, the poor, women, and the ostracized. Jesus challenged the unjust socioeconomic and religious structures of his day, and his ministry touched all segments of society, regardless of ethnic backgrounds. The life Christ offers us is life in all its fullness. This fullness is not offered in some distant, far-off future, but in our present circumstances. Indeed, Christ is our liberator, and God in Christ wills that we should be free. Therefore, we need to stand firm and must not submit to anything that dehumanizes or enslaves us. We are talking not only about the millions of people in our world today who are enslaved to sin and evil and in need of forgiveness and new life, but also about the millions who are enslaved by injustice and oppression, by people in power and in need of political liberation. Seeking justice requires us to confront the underlying inequities and the power structures of oppression. Our response to suffering must extend beyond meeting basic needs to naming the injustices that perpetuate suffering, challenging oppressive political systems, and acting to ensure a more just and equitable world.